This week in wrestling history, I see WWE this week on SmackDown started airing their own This Week in History segment. Try to keep up, boys. There's a lot of history to cover. 71 years ago this week, you won't hear about this on SmackDown. 71 years ago this week on February 7th, 1950. You may have heard the name Leroy McGuirk before. Jim Ross speaks of him often as he drove McGuirk around a lot and was almost like an errand boy for him back in the late 70s when he was promoting wrestling. McGuirk was. Before that, though, Leroy was a world champion wrestler. He held the NWA Junior Heavyweight title over 10 years straight, which would make him the longest reigning singles male champion of all time. That all came to an end on this date. He was a passenger in a car being driven by one of his trainees. They were on their way to a restaurant when the guy slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting another car, and McGuirk went flying into the windshield, smashing his glasses, pieces of which went into his one good eye, causing him to go blind. He was already blind in his other eye after a swimming accident as a kid, so now he was fully blind. So that ended his wrestling career. He had to forfeit the title. One of my favorite stories is the Leroy McGuirk story that JR tells. McGuirk had a daughter named Michelle, and I guess he really wanted a boy, so he just referred to her as Mike. She was the Mike McGuirk who did ring announcing in WWE in the late 80s, early 90s. I think it was more the early 90s period. And Bobby Heenan would always make fun of her on commentary. But anyway, as JR tells the story, Leroy was working for Bill Watts at the time, as was Ross, and it was his job to get Leroy to the TV tapings on time. JR picks him up one day, and Leroy hands him his travel bag, and he says, "Look inside." And inside, Jim Ross finds a bottle of whiskey, a box of cigars, and a .44 Magnum. Sounds like the kind of locker room The Undertaker would love. So JR asks him, he goes, "What's with the gun?" And Leroy tells him, "We're going to kill Ted DiBiase." Note the word we, not I. We are going to kill Ted DiBiase. Because he says he's dating my daughter. And he had this whole this wasn't like a joke. I mean, he had this whole well thought out plan. This was not just drunk talk. Because he was drunk, but it wasn't just the booze talking. He had all of this mapped out. He had thought about this. He had really taken the time to think about this and map this out. He was going to have Ross tell DiBiase, "Hey, Leroy wants you to go to his room. He's got this great idea for you that he wants to talk to you about." And when DiBiase would go to the door and he would announce himself, Leroy would just empty the chamber right through the door and hope that one of the bullets connected. So they're driving along, and JR is totally freaked out because his boss is going to kill this guy and make him an accessory to murder. Totally not focused on the fact that the ash from the cigar that Leroy is smoking, because remember, he's blind, so he probably can't tell that the ash is about to fall from the end of his cigar. And it lands on his crotch, and it starts to burn a hole through his pants. Leroy starts shouting, "What the fuck?" And JR has no idea what's wrong. He's swerving all over the road because now he's spooked. He pulls over on the side of the road to get out because he's going to go see what's wrong. And he can see the smoke. He can see the smoke billowing up, but he can't quite, figure out exactly where the source is. He can't figure out where it's coming from. And Leroy says, "My balls, Jim! My balls! They're burning!" So JR starts blowing on his balls like he's blowing out a birthday cake to no avail. And now Ross is praying to God that a state trooper doesn't drive by to see this young kid pulled over on the side of the road with his head buried in his boss's crotch, because that's not going to look too good. Starts slapping his balls. So eventually the flame is extinguished. He gets back in the car. There's this very uncomfortable silence for the rest of the trip. He stops off at a service station on the side of the road, because he's looking for a payphone. He's going to call Bill Watts to tell him about the murder plot. Let's not forget that this man is still plotting a murder. And so he tells Watts about this, and Watts starts laughing. JR didn't find it very funny, but Watts thought it was a riot. He thought it was hysterical. And he tells JR, okay, look, because this guy was a known drunk, he says he's probably close to passing out from the whiskey. Get to the hotel, put him to bed. By the time you get there, I'll already be there, and I'll take him off your hands. Just get to the hotel, and I'll take care of the rest. And that's what he did. And just like that, the $1 Million Man's life was spared. 33 years ago this week on February 5th, 1988, one of the most historic shows in WWE history. You heard Hulk Hogan talking about it on SmackDown. They actually did a whole segment, a whole video package on it on Friday night, talking about the debut edition of the main event. This was live on NBC. This was different from Saturday night's main event. This aired in prime time, live on a Friday night. They only ever did 5 of these shows between 1988 and 1991. And this was the first and by far the most successful, featuring the rematch from WrestleMania 3 between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant for the WWE Championship. It remains to this day the most watched pro wrestling show and the most watched pro wrestling match on television. They got a 15.2 Nielsen rating, which equates to 33 million viewers. 33 years ago this week, WWE had 33 million viewers on NBC, tuning in to see at least part of this show. It was also the first appearance of the Winged Eagle title, which is still the best of all the WWF belts, in my opinion. In the pre-match promo backstage with Hogan, he was still wearing the old 1986 Hogan belt, as it was called. But when he came out for the match, like magic, the eagle appeared around his waist. Not only that, but he wasn't as wet and as oily as he was in the back. I always love how he looked totally different when he would come out than he looked in the back just minutes earlier doing this obviously pre-taped interview with Mean Gene. But this was a first. This was the first time the belt had morphed. It transformed into a totally different belt when he walked out. So, a lot of people probably always thought, okay, WrestleMania 4 is the first appearance of the Eagle belt when Robin Leach brought it down to the ring on that red velvet tray or whatever and presented it. But in fact, Hogan just randomly walked out with it on television and there was no acknowledgement of it at all. It was just magically there. Now the show opened with an Intercontinental title defense by the Honky Tonk Man against the Macho Man Randy Savage. As the story goes, they wanted Honky to drop the belt to Macho, but he refused. He refused out of what he has since claimed was a fear that with many, he knew that there would be a lot of people watching. I don't know that anybody thought 33 million people would be tuned in, but he's thinking, okay, we're going to be live on NBC, this first big live primetime NBC special on broadcast television. And with that many people watching, for him to go out there and lose, he felt that it could hurt his value if he ever wanted to leave and go work somewhere else, like, the NWA or something, who he claims he was in conversations with at that time. And again, this is Honky's version of the story now. He claims not only was he talking to, I guess it wouldn't have been maybe it would have been WCW by that point. He was talking to them. They told him, no, absolutely not. Do not drop the belt. And he met with them, but then ultimately he decided to stay with Vince McMahon. Now, I smell BS about the sequence of events there, but that's just my gut feeling. But he did refuse to drop the belt. Savage won by countout instead. And as it turned out, Savage got the world title. I guess that was his consolation prize. Ted DiBiase has always been of the impression that he was going to win the title of WrestleMania 4. Now, that doesn't mean that was going to be the plan, but even DiBiase himself, after all these years, has always believed or was told, maybe not by Vince himself, but he has always been of the impression that he would have been the world champion that night of WrestleMania had things gone a different way here on this show. And he had a little bit of animosity towards Honky Tonk Man for many years because of it. He basically screwed him out of a world title run. DiBiase and Virgil on this show, they were instead, not instead, but on this show, they were in Andre's corner for his match with Hogan. He had been trying to buy the belt. He was trying to buy the title from Hogan. Hogan wouldn't sell, so he ended up aligning with Andre. The match itself was horrendous. Andre could just barely, if you thought he could barely move a WrestleMania 3, this was even worse. He was barely mobile, even at this point. And think about this, he was still wrestling in the company through 1990. He only got worse. He never had that condition treated. His body was growing. He was beat up. He was hurt. He had the back problems. He had a back operation, I think, the previous year. So Andre how he even managed to stay upright is a miracle. So the match itself wasn't very good, but it's the finish, right? This wasn't about work rate. With Hogan and Andre, it was never about work rate. Hogan Andre, when I think of the most iconic matches in wrestling, it's always Hogan Andre. It's always WrestleMania 3. So them having a rematch was a very big deal. It was the finish, though, that people remember. Andre slammed Hogan to the mat, kind of fell down on top of him. He went for the cover. Hogan clearly got his shoulder up after the 1 count. But the referee counted to 3 anyway. He never even bothered to look up. He just looked down at the mat and counted 1, 2, 3. And just like that, Hogan's 4-year run as the champion came to an end. Mean Gene went to interview Andre in the ring immediately after the match. Andre announced that he was surrendering the World Tag Team Championship to Ted DiBiase. His words. His words, not mine. I don't know why. He called it the World Tag Team. He's surrendering the World Tag Team title to Ted DiBiase. And DiBiase now had the belt strapped around his waist. DiBiase actually defended the belt at some house shows. He defended it at some of the live events in the days following this event until a ruling was made by Jack Tunney that, in fact, you cannot just hand the title to somebody else. That's not how this works. And so the championship instead was vacated. It was put up in a tournament at WrestleMania. While all of this was going on, though, that night at the end of the match, another referee, looking very much like referee Dave Hebner, or who we thought was referee Dave Hebner, suddenly appeared and he was staring at the other ref. Hogan couldn't believe what he was seeing. They're identical. It's almost like they're twins or something. And when Earl attacks Dave, who I guess he must have been locked in a closet. He locked his brother in a closet backstage or something. Dave was in the company first as a referee. Earl was working at the time for the NWA. When someone in WWE, and I wish I knew who, because I would love to applaud them and give them all the kudos, because this is one of the greatest ideas they ever came up with. I don't know if it was a Vince McMahon idea, if it was a Pat Patterson idea. I don't know if Bruce Pritchard was there at that point. I think he was, but whoever's idea it was, maybe it was a collaborative effort. It was an incredible concept here, because they wanted to get Earl, so they got him away from the NWA, and they kept this whole thing under wraps, and they kept him hidden and everything because they wanted maximum impact when he showed up in the ring, because they did very much look alike. Now, if you look at Dave and Earl side by side back then, it is easy to tell who's who, because Dave was a little heavier in the face. He was probably a little heavier, period. So you could tell, I think, if you just stared at the two of them side by side. But from afar, or for someone who was a fan who didn't know that there was a second Hebner, your mind was blown watching this. This was quite a thing to see. But when Earl started kicking his brother's ass here, Hogan knew that Earl was the one who got paid off. He said, okay, you're the one, because you're the crooked referee. You're the one who got paid off by the multi-million-dollar man. And he picked Earl up way above his head. Hogan probably didn't know his own strength back then, because this was peak Hogan, so there you go. And he tossed him out of the ring. Now, the idea was he would toss Earl, I guess, probably into the arms of DiBiase or Andre. Well, he overshot his target, and poor Earl Hebner went flying over DiBiase and Virgil's heads right in front of Andre, who just stood there. Andre didn't even make any attempt to catch this guy or cushion his fall. He just sort of watched. as Earl Hebner splatted on the floor in the aisleway. If I remember, I think Earl broke one of his brother's ribs. I think it was just one rib on that punt kick that he gave him when he kicked Dave out of the ring. He was so amped up, he was probably just so excited to be out there. Got a little carried away. So the Hebners took a beating that night. I don't think Dave did much refereeing after this. He transitioned into the road agent role, so he'd be the guy who sometimes would come out and you would see him in the background trying to break up a fight or something for many years. Earl went on to become the most famous referee in the history of the company, especially after Montreal. He is the most infamous referee in the history of the company. He will be forever linked to what happened that night. But I've always personally loved Earl Hebner's referee style, and I think he's one of the best that there has ever been. But I have found in recent years there is a very vocal segment of the population, of the fan population, who believe just the opposite. They actually think that Earl Hebner is one of the worst referees because he always made it about him. He was always, he was always getting in the way. He was always mugging for the camera, doing those slow, dramatic counts that none of the other referees did. He was out there trying to get himself over and make himself a part of the show, when really I would think you're supposed to just sort of blend into the background and let the talent get over. It's not about you, it's about the wrestlers. So I can actually get that. I can understand that point of view. I personally loved those dramatic, slow counts for a lot of those pay-per-view main events. I think it actually added to them. But, if you feel the opposite about Earl, I can understand why. I still laugh when I watch the end of the match with Stone Cold and The Rock at WrestleMania 19, when Rock leans in to say something private to Austin, because he knew that was it. He knew that was the end of Austin's career. 2 different times, The Rock had to physically reach over and shove Earl Hebner out of the way when Earl tried to lean in and eavesdrop on their conversation. It's like, get out of the way. But that was Earl. That was Earl Hebner. The evil twin Hebner angle, all-time classic. Hogan afterwards cried and whined about the plastic surgery. How much for the plastic surgery, Mean Gene? When I turned around, they were identical. Look at the referee when he counts to 3. Look at the $100 bills falling out of his pocket. 32 years ago this week, on February 3rd, 1989, the Mega Powers exploded live on the main event on NBC. Year 2 of doing this main event special on NBC. In a tag team match, it was the Mega Powers of Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, or Lust Hogan, as Savage called him, taking on the Twin Towers of the Big Boss Man and Akeem, the African Dream. One of the greatest storylines in WWE history, Savage and Hogan came together in late 87 as the Mega Powers. That got Savage over as a huge babyface who stepped in for Hogan when he left in 88 to go film the movie No Holds Barred. Savage basically took over as the champion. They wrestled their first tag match together at SummerSlam that year. Cracks, though, were quickly forming in their friendship. Hogan was overly affectionate, shall we say, with Miss Elizabeth. He would request that Elizabeth come out to the ring with him when he would have his singles matches. And on occasions, it would put her in danger, and Savage would have to come out and make the save, and so that didn't sit well with him. At Survivor Series, after their big win, Hogan literally picked Elizabeth up into the air and was being very touchy-feely with her. Savage stood there and couldn't believe what he was seeing. And at the Royal Rumble, Hogan accidentally eliminated Randy Savage from the match. This all led to the match here, with Elizabeth taking a pretty wicked bump when Akeem tossed Savage through the ropes. Savage collided with Liz, ass first. He just wiped her out. Hogan immediately ran over to check on both of them. He seemed more interested in helping out Elizabeth, which you can understand. Elizabeth is, back then, Elizabeth, I don't know. She was probably, what do you think she was? 100, maybe 110, 120 pounds soaking wet. She was a tiny person compared to these big giants, these big giant wrestlers in the company. And so he's more interested in checking on her to make sure that she's okay. Hogan picks Elizabeth up in his arms and carries her to the back, and he leaves his partner, her man, he leaves Savage in the ring to die at the hands of the Twin Towers. There were two very memorable botches during this match, one or both of which are, I'm guessing, edited out of the WWE Network version of this show. One involves Hogan and Elizabeth. Back in the trainer's room, she's laying on a gurney and Hogan is down on his knees at her bedside. You would think this woman is being read her last rites. Hogan is just sobbing and holding her hand and praying for her to be all right. And when they come back from commercial, they cut back to the trainer's room. And Hogan has calmed down. He's still holding her hand. He's down on his knees and looking down and praying, I guess, brother. And he's waiting for his cue. But he doesn't realize that they're already back live. So he starts speaking in Carney. And he's asking, somebody give me the tizime. And then he's asking for a countdown. Give me a countdown or something. And when he's told that they're live, instantly he morphs back into Hogan mode. And he starts telling Elizabeth, oh, I'm so happy that you're okay. My God, I'm so happy. I'm so happy you're all right. If you ever wondered why Hogan's Hollywood career fizzled out and The Rock went on to become the biggest star in Hollywood, I give you Hogan's acting skills here as Exhibit A. I've seen community theater plays better than his acting job here on this show. As much as I love this angle, you go back and watch his acting job here, it's pretty bad. Elizabeth tells him to go back to the ring, go help Randy, and so off he goes. Hogan goes back to the ring. Savage, though, when he tags out, he smacks the taste out of Hogan's mouth. He retrieves his belt. And now he leaves Hogan high and dry. But it's Hogan. So, of course, Hogan wins the match all on his own. 2-on-1. And that's where the other botch occurred. Akeem and the Big Boss Man hit the ring ropes at the same time, or they were going to hit the ropes. I think that was the plan. We'll hit the ropes at the same time and come off for a double splash. Hogan will move. Well, the Boss Man hit the ropes, I would say, a split second before Akeem did. And both these guys were gigantic. I mean, Akeem looked physically bigger than Boss Man. This is before Boss Man really lost the weight. He used to be very heavy. So he hit the ropes first. And when Akeem hit the ropes, he fell out of the ring. I mean, he fell through the ropes straight down on top of his head. You could see his feet up in the air. And I don't know how he didn't break it, especially with all that weight coming down as suddenly as he did. I'm shocked he didn't break his neck. I mean, it's funny when you watch it, but, it could have been catastrophic. Thankfully, he wasn't injured, or he wasn't seriously injured, so you can kind of laugh at it. Akeem had to be every bit of 350, maybe 400, but every bit of 350 at that point. So Hogan won the match. He heads straight back to the trainer's room, and he's looking for the Macho Man, and he finds him. Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me, brother? I know it was an accident, you wiping out Elizabeth, but why did you do that? Why did you leave me out there? And Savage told him, he goes, look, you guys, I should be number 1 in the Mega Powers. I'm the champion. You guys got me in the back seat. I'm number 3. He says, man to man, you never challenged me for a title match. You know why? Because you can't beat me. And then he blindsided Hogan with the belt. Elizabeth tried to shield Hogan. Savage, though, threw her backwards out of camera view. I hope somebody was there waiting for her, because boy did Savage throw this woman. Holy shit. I hope there was maybe like a mattress there or something, because he threw her halfway across the room. And actually, this reminds me, there was a third botch that I forgot about. There was a third botch here. Brutus Beefcake was supposed to make the save for Hogan. So Savage was teasing he was going to hit Hogan with the belt. Brutus was going to grab the belt and stop Savage. Brutus entered the camera view too soon. He entered the scene a little too early and quickly realized his mistake, or somebody said, "Hey, get the fuck back here." So he comes on camera, but then quickly gets off camera. So now you know that Brutus is just standing there, which is weird because he's just standing off to the side, waiting for his cue to come back, and eventually he does, and he grabs the belt out of Savage's hand, and Savage knocks him down. I had forgotten about that. But at the end of the show, just to kind of wrap this up and put a bow on it, Hogan went on a rampage. He was looking for Randy Savage, going from dressing room to dressing room, down the hallway. And the two wrestlers that he physically accosted in the hallway, a young Bret Hart and a young Shawn Michaels, one half of the Hart Foundation and one half of the Rockers. This is my all-time favorite angle in wrestling, followed closely by the snakebite angle with Savage and Jake the Snake in 91. But if you're ever wondering, hey, what's your favorite? This one right here. This is number one. 31 years ago this week on February 6, 1990, WCW presented Clash of the Champions 10, Texas Shootout, live on TBS. Sting had joined the Four Horsemen a few months earlier, and then he had won a tournament at Starrcade to become the number one contender for the World Heavyweight title, which was held at that time by fellow Horseman Ric Flair. Fast forward to the Clash, and the Horsemen are in the ring, and Ole Anderson cuts this great promo on Sting, basically booting him out of the Horsemen and telling him to give up his title shot. And he said that he tolerated Sting being part of their group. It really was Flair's idea to keep him around. Sting couldn't understand what was happening, and they all beat him up. And Flair told him he had until the end of the night to back out of their upcoming championship match. So later in the night, it was Arn, it was Flair, and it was Ole in a cage against Gary Hart's team of the Great Muta, Buzz Sawyer, and the Dragon Master. I don't remember who the fuck the Dragon Master was. The Horsemen, of course, won. After the match, Sting ran down, and he was supposed to climb the cage and go after Flair. That was the plan. Sting is going to charge down to the ring after the beatdown earlier on, scale the cage, and either brawl with Flair at the top of the cage, or he was going to climb into the cage and have a brawl inside there with Flair. So all these baby faces are like holding Sting back, trying to get him to not go into the cage. And it was the second time that Sting hit the cage that things went wrong. Sting hits the cage, and he starts to climb, and he blew out his knee. Tore his patella tendon. On Flair's old Woo Nation podcast from a few years ago, Sting said that he interviewed Sting, and they were talking about this, and Sting said that he looked down, he knew something was wrong, and he looked down, and he was feeling around with his hand, and he said his kneecap was basically in his thigh. Flair said he had no idea Sting was even hurt. You know, he saw that Sting couldn't climb in. He was wondering what the hell's going on. And he could clearly see Sting kind of hobbling on one leg and being held back by everybody. He just thought he was, I guess, selling. I don't know what he would have been selling, but he didn't think that there was anything wrong. He just thought that he's selling. Okay, well, if he's not going to come in after me, then I'll go after him. And Flair exits the cage. The match is over now. Flair exits the cage through the door. And I have never seen Ric Flair run so fast in my entire life. He sprinted. He sprinted towards Sting in the aisleway because he was supposed to tackle him. So he goes and he tackles Sting, and Sting is telling Doug Dillinger, the head of security, who's there, and he's telling Wahoo McDaniel, who's one of the people holding him back. He's saying, look, Flair's going to tackle me. You need to tell him to stop him. But there was no stopping him. Flair jumped into the pile of bodies. He basically back body dropped himself. He kind of flipped over the whole pile. He came in with such momentum. And Sting looks up and he's telling him, Rick, my leg is broken. Please get off me. So a week later, Sting is having surgery with Dr. James Andrews in Birmingham. And he's being told that he's going to be out for a minimum of 7 months. And the injury could not have come at a worse time, because Flair was going to drop the belt to Sting at their next pay-per-view, which was Wrestle War 90. So with Sting gone, Jim Herd says to Flair, all right, well, you're going to drop the belt to Lex Luger instead. And Flair refused. he had already promised Sting the belt, and he wanted to keep his word. And Sting made it back in 5 months, not 7. And Flair, as he told him he would, Flair dropped the belt to him in July at the Great American Bash. 21 years ago, on February 3rd, 2000, WWE and NBC jointly announced the formation of a new football league called the XFL. The X did not stand for anything. They talked about Extreme Fun League. In reality, the X didn't stand for a damn thing. It was promoted as real football without the pansy penalties for being too rough. I know it's easy to make fun of the XFL, and God knows there were plenty of reasons to do so. Yeah, they had those stupid skits with the cheerleaders. They were as horrendous as some of the worst comedy you would see on Raw. Vince McMahon thought that this is what the broader audience wanted to see. Clearly they didn't, as the ratings plummeted every single week. But they did that, and they had this fake feud that they tried to manufacture between Jesse Ventura and Rusty Tillman, who was one of the coaches. The fact that it lasted all of one season before they pulled the plug, and Vince ended up losing over $30 million on the league. I think NBC had to eat the other 30 or so million. That's not really a surprise. I mean, they went from doing over 15 million viewers for the very first game on, I think on NBC it probably was, because it aired on NBC and UPN. Over 15 million people they did for that first game. A year later, they were down to around 1 million. McMahon did want to continue. He didn't want to throw in the towel, but without NBC on board, then they had no choice but to basically close up shop. They still had a television deal, though, with UPN, as it was called at that time, and they had a deal with TNN. But UPN wanted to, if they continued, UPN apparently wanted them to slash SmackDown from 2 hours to 90 minutes, and Vince was not interested in doing that, and so that was the end of the XFL. But the XFL, in a lot of ways, was pretty innovative. I mean, the NFL ended up using that Skycam view that the XFL popularized. I don't think the XFL created. They didn't invent that camera view, but they did popularize it on a more mainstream scale, and the NFL has used it ever since. They had a pregame scramble instead of a coin flip. Unfortunately, on the very first play of the very first game, during the scramble, we also had the very first XFL injury, so maybe that wasn't such a good idea. They did away with the point after on touchdowns because they figured it was a guaranteed point. So the NFL was, or the XFL rather, was ahead of its time in some ways. It just didn't work in execution. People watch football for football. They don't watch football to see pro wrestling. The most recent XFL relaunch was abandoned quickly, in part due to COVID. We'll see if The Rock has better luck with it when they relaunch it and they try again next year. 4 days later, on February 7th, 2000, Monday Night Raw aired from Dallas with one of my favorite matches in Raw history. It was Triple H and the Radicals in the main event. That was Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn, who had all made the jump from WCW only a couple of weeks earlier. Eddie Guerrero had dislocated his elbow in his first match in, so he was injured. He was on the outside there for moral support. They faced off with The Rock, Cactus Jack, Rikishi, and Too Cool in a 10-man tag match that was so and I think did I mention X-Pac? X-Pac was in the match too. I like how I kind of throw that in as an afterthought. Like, I think X-Pac was in that match as well. But this crowd was so electric. They could have powered all the lights in the building just with the energy that this crowd was generating on this night in that building. So much fun to watch. Triple H hit a pedigree on Grandmaster Sexay, and Benoit landed a diving headbutt for the win, which Foley broke up. He wasn't supposed to. So the referee just kept counting, and that was the end of the match. The New Age Outlaws ran down with a bunch of lead pipes and started laying people out. And so all the heels are laying waste to the baby faces when all of a sudden the lights go out. And Jim Ross says, "Oh, we've lost power." And out onto the stage walks a very slimmed down Paul Bearer, who had been gone for months. I thought he was bringing The Undertaker out with him. Undertaker had not been seen since September. And as he mentioned recently on Joe Rogan's podcast, around that time, he was in the gym preparing for a comeback, that month, in fact, when he tore his pec. I don't know if this spot was meant for him or not. I always figured he would have been back in the Royal Rumble match, maybe a surprise entrant, but maybe not. You know, if he wasn't going to win the Rumble, maybe the plan would have been to just wait and have him return on TV a week or two later. Maybe this spot would have been for him, but instead we got Kane making his return. I say return. I mean, Kane had only been off television for 2 weeks. Jim Ross was screaming, Kane is back. You would think this guy had been gone for 6 months. And Kane laid waste to all the heels. This was my favorite version of Kane. Original mask, original music, but early 2000 Kane was just badass personified. This guy was just a walking unit. This guy was unbelievable just in terms of a monster. Could not have been booked any better than he was here. This guy just destroyed anything and everything in his path. WCW Monday Nitro did a 2.7 rating that night as compared to Raw's 6.5, which was the largest margin of victory by either side head-to-head in the history of the Monday Night War. 13 years ago this week, on February 5th, 2008, Bobby Lashley announced on his website that he had parted ways with WWE, writing the following: "Circumstances which are out of my control left me no decision but to leave the WWE. I can't go into details right now, but like I said before, sometimes people will hate you personally and try to destroy you," which is what happened here. "Evil has prevailed. However, if you continue your struggle, doors will open around these people. You have not seen the last of me, so please don't stop your support. Add Bobby Lashley to the list of recently released." One story had him quitting because of what happened with his then-girlfriend, Crystal Marshall, who was fired. She was released from the company. The more prevalent story pointed to issues behind the scenes with Michael Hayes, and in a 2016 interview with ESPN, Lashley implied that that may have had a lot to do with it without directly saying so or naming him. He said, "There are certain people in the business who may not want you there, and that's why I left the first time. I don't know if there is even a possibility of going back, but their schedule is challenging. A lot of their guys are dealing with that. If I were to go back full time, it would have to be something we sit down and really piece together and make it make sense." Spoiler alert, he came back. 11 years ago this week, on February 2nd, 2010, marked the death of WWE's version of ECW. During an episode of ECW on Sci-Fi, Vince McMahon walked out and announced the following. He said, "I would like to proudly announce that in 3 weeks' time, ECW will be going off the air. I would like to thank all the technicians, cameramen, directors, producers, everyone, and certainly all the superstars who made ECW the success it truly was. But I would also like to thank in advance all of you who will be responsible for the success in bringing a new, innovative, never-before-seen broadcast at the very same time here on Sci-Fi. This will be the next evolution of the WWE. This will be the next evolution of television history. Thank you very much." That new show turned out to be NXT, featuring rookies from their FCW developmental territory participating in various competitions to become WWE's next big breakout star. That was the concept. And they would pair off these new guys with pros. Each guy would have his own pro from the main roster to mentor them. This is where Daniel Bryan, as a rookie, that's what they called him. I guess he was. He was a WWE rookie. Daniel Bryan, the rookie, was paired off with The Miz as his pro. And 1 year ago this week, on February 7th, 2020, Bill Goldberg appeared on Friday Night SmackDown via satellite and issued a challenge to The Fiend, Bray Wyatt, for a Universal title match later that month at the company's Super Showdown in Saudi Arabia, saying that watching the Royal Rumble with his son gave him the itch to come back into the ring, and since Brock Lesnar has his hands full, defending the WWE title, I figured, why not go back after the Universal title? We don't need to relive what happened there because I'm sure I'll be doing that in a few weeks when we get to that match here in the history segment. Plus, I'm in a good mood right now. I would like to keep it that way, so we'll just leave it at that. And that is this week in wrestling history.